In this part, we're going to talk about cells. These are the smallest units of living things. So the first part is about cell structure and function in organelles. And next, we'll talk about properties of cell membranes, and then we'll compare prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So let's look at each of these units in a little bit more detail. For the cell structure and function of organelles unit, we're going to talk about basics of what makes a cell. And then we're going to talk about cytoplasm and the cell membrane. We'll talk about some specific organelles, the nucleus, ribosomes, the ER, Golgi apparatus, mitochondria, like what you've got here, and chloroplasts, which are similar but have a very different function. Then we'll talk about the cytoskeleton and the cell wall. And in the second unit, we'll talk about cell membranes. This picture here is a great cross-section of a typical cell membrane, and you can see that there are lots of different things inside the membrane. So we're going to talk about what some of these things are. We'll get into membrane basics, what selective permeability means, the basics of transport, or in other words, moving things from one side of the membrane to another. And we'll talk about active and passive transport. And finally, we'll talk about the difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So what are the basics of these cell types, and then a little bit more detail about characteristics of these cells. And then this picture here is a great example of a bacterial cell. This is a prokaryote, Borrelia burgdorferi, and this is the bacterium that causes Lyme disease. And so you can see that this is an interesting squiggle shape compared to the red blood cells in a person. So we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between both of these two types of cells.